if you've paid attention to the news at all over the past month, you've seen, along with everything else that has been going on in the world, that there was fighting that broke out in Israel, between Israel and Palestine, once again. And of course, the ceasefire has been signed now, but this is, just another conflict that has really been it's pretty common for that country since its sort of refounding in the late 1940s. This has kind of always been a tension between these two groups, and it's causing a lot of politicians, a lot of speakers, a lot of people and leaders out there to say some very polarizing things, to say things that I think kind of paint the picture in more of a black and white sort of sense than what I think we should be looking at it as. Now, I brought up our verse today, which is, from the Psalm 122, which is saying to pray for the peace of Jerusalem. And this is something that does get brought up a lot whenever we talk about Israel, and especially in churches. And I do think it is important for us to pray for the peace of Jerusalem, to pray for the peace for Israel itself. But I think we need to, as Christians, be cautious and understand that there is another group of people here who are really dealing with a lot of suffering and have dealt with a lot of suffering at the same time. And we also need to remember that group of people have also caused a lot of suffering to the Jews as well, the Jews who live in Israel. So it's a situation that we need to take some time and just kind of reflect on. To give a very general sort of historical overview of Israel in the 20th century, in the 1940s, Israel declared its independence from Great Britain. This was after World War II. Britain had held Palestine for several decades at this point. Might have even been a little bit longer, but I'm not remembering those dates exactly. And there had been kind of some pushes in that region for independence for that area during that time. And Israel declared their independence. They had been kind of getting into conflicts with the British government in that area. So had the Palestinians as well. But when they had attempted to rebel, Israel didn't really support them. And this, of course, caused a lot of controversy and a lot of issues. And what ended up actually happening is that the nations around Israel invaded, claiming that they were going to restore peace and order to the area, and that they needed to defend the Palestinian people. And this resulted in the Arab-Israeli War. And really, from that point sort of onward, Israel has been finding itself in these wars with these countries around them. And it's easy to kind of think, well, there must be a good reason for that, like a sort of reason that we can kind of understand, like that maybe Israel must be doing something. But the reality is that hasn't really been the case. Now, there are nations that have managed to establish peace with Israel. The most noticeable one would be Egypt. But there are still nations around them that, frankly, want to see Israel wiped off the map. They want to see that Jewish state gone. And this is very, very, very problematic. And it's something which, whenever we talk about these things, I think we need to keep in mind. We're talking about a group of people here who, for their history, have kind of been, the little kid on the playground getting bullied. And I know that sounds a little bit weird, because especially if you look at the Israeli army now, you'd think, well, that doesn't seem like the case at all. But remember, Israel is about the size of New Jersey, and it doesn't have that huge of a population either. So the fact that it has been able to survive under these circumstances is really quite amazing. And obviously the military has a lot to do with that. And obviously that has also kind of changed how Israel is in that sort of situation. They kind of went from being the little kid being bullied on the playground to a little kid who's now bulked up, taken several MMA classes, and is now kind of bullying their former bullies. rightfully or wrongly so. And that's something that we always kind of need to keep in the back of our minds context-wise whenever we're dealing with this, that Israel does have very real security concerns. Now, with that being said, this doesn't justify the discrimination that exists against the Palestinian people within that country. Now, it is true, it is true that Palestinians have committed terrorist acts against Israel. We've just seen Hamas, which is a Palestinian group, a political party almost, that was launching rockets recently into Israel, and I mean that's very much a terrorist act. There's a wall that has been built in Israel to kind of separate the West Bank from the rest of Israel, because for a while, every single day you were having it seemed like you were having a suicide bombing on buses and stuff. And so the feeling was we need to somehow set up a security checkpoint so that we can try and prevent this type of stuff from happening to protect our citizens. And this is very real, but it at the same time doesn't justify some of the other things that we're seeing. And it is very true that there has been a tendency with kind of the increase in migration of Jewish individuals to the country of Israel, which is not a bad thing at all. There has been a tendency for Palestinians who have lived there for a very long time themselves to be getting removed from areas that they themselves have lived in for years, and kind of unjustly so. Now, to be clear, this is not something that if you were to ask the common average Israeli citizen, that they would necessarily kind of ignore and say, well, no, that's just anti-Israel propaganda. I think you'd be surprised in finding that there's a number of Israelis who'd be like, yeah, no, some of this stuff is kind of messed up and we really need to fix it. But that kind of brings me to my next sort of point here, which is that this is not a situation, again, where, we can look at the Palestinians and say that they themselves are completely innocent. We just had, a few years ago, an attempt to broker peace between the two sides, to create kind of a lasting sort of situation where they're not fighting each other, where Palestine does have its own territory and its own, recognized rights, and Israel does as well. And, while I understand why Palestinian leaders might not have wanted to sign the deal that was placed before them, they didn't exactly come to the negotiating table either. And that's problematic. If we're talking about a group of people who leadership-wise seem like their leaders don't necessarily have their best interest in mind. And it should be noted that Hamas does kind of count as their leadership. When the Palestinian government had its last kind of, you could call it their version of the parliament or Congress, the last time before that kind of all fell apart in 2007, the main group that had the most seats was Hamas. So this is a little bit more complicated than just what we're kind of hearing of people saying, Palestinians are being, so terribly mistreated. We gotta just support them. And, oh no, Israel is, it's wonderful. And the Palestinians are, it's really not that case. Both sides are doing a lot of things to cause this problem. So this returns me back to what I kind of was getting at with bringing up this verse about praying for the peace of Jerusalem and what specifically that means for us as Christians. I personally believe that we should be very supportive of Israel, that we should be with them, but that doesn't mean that we blindly support everything they do. If your friend goes out and does something wrong, you should go out and say, hey, maybe you shouldn't be doing that. And I see that as the same way with Israel, that we do need to at times be having these conversations with them and saying, this really is kind of messed up here. Because we are trying, that will actually help them. If they stop giving reasons for people to want to fight back at them and to feel like they are being oppressed, and to actually, give them the freedom and the feeling that they are not being oppressed, and not just the feeling, but the actuality of that. I think a lot of these issues that Israel has faced throughout the years with Palestine would go away. On the flip side, though, as well, the Palestinians are not exactly an innocent victim here either. There really needs to be a push to elevate leadership that wants a peaceful solution there. And that's who we should be supporting. We shouldn't just be blindly supporting Palestine in that sort of sense. Again, we should be, feeling bad for the citizens, for the civilians who have been heavily affected by all of this, and they have suffered more, I would say, than Israel itself, even though Israel has suffered a lot. This is a situation where leadership needs to be there that's going to fix this. And that really should be what our prayers are. And that really should be what our push is. Because otherwise we will not see peace in Jerusalem. And we should be working to the best of our ability to get there. So that is all I have for you this week. I hope that you found it helpful. I hope you found it informative. I'm going to go ahead and leave you all with our last song this Sunday, and I will see you next week.